Hey everyone, welcome to episode 16 of The Balanced Lens, where we examine faith, culture, and politics from a balanced perspective. Here on our podcast, we don't take sides, but instead we try to lay out the facts, offer pragmatic analysis, and hopefully apply a biblical and Christian worldview. And the topic for today is the second part of American foreign policy. We're talking through the national security strategy of the United States of America. It's a document published by every administration where they outline their framework of foreign policy in the world and what they expect. And in our first episode, if you tuned in, we talked about a few important questions. What exactly is a national security strategy? The document laid out how America went astray. It talked about what America wants and their expectations from the world. And as we dig in today, we're talking about three more questions that are important. And it leads into this question: what are America's available means to get what we want in the world? In other words, what is our leverage to do this in the foreign policy?
So the document talks about how the US retains the world's most enviable position in terms of what we are able to leverage in order to hit our goals. So it starts off with a few items. Number one, we are very nimble. We're still pretty nimble in spite of how large we are as a country. Our political system can adjust and correct if there was some places where we went astray, right? Or we just miscalculated. The second point talks about how we are the largest and the most innovative economy, which generates wealth and can invest in strategic interests. And it provides leverage because we also know that we are a consumer market, which means other countries need us in order for them to thrive. Number three, it talks about how we are the world's leading financial system and our capital markets are pretty robust. And it also talks about how we have the dollar, which is a global reserve currency. Number four, it talks about the US having the most advanced and innovative technology sector, which is one of the foundational elements to our economic growth. And it provides a specific edge to our military and thereby also strengthens our global influence. Number five, it talks about how we have the most powerful, capable, dare I say, the experienced military in the world. Then it talks about in number six, it talks about us having a broad network of alliances, treaties, and partners across the world and the most important regions, across the most important regions. Number seven, it talks about us having a very unique and enviable geography with a lot of natural resources. And thankfully, if it talks about the Western Hemisphere as not having any competing powers that we have to constantly look over. So we don't have any imminent threats at our borders from military invasion, and whatever competition that we have or rivalries that we have within the world, like say Russia and China, are separated by vast oceans. Then it also talks about us having soft power and cultural influence in the world, where, and we all know because we came from the eastern part of the world where people crave to become part of an American culture. It's lauded, and a lot of people love being aligned with American culture. Then finally, it also talks about the courage and the willpower that the American people have, where they will spring to action whenever it's needed, and they show high levels of patriotism, which is very, very important in how we became a dominant force in the world.
Yeah, fascinating, right? If you read through this section and think through what entails national security, right? You never think about the courage and willpower of people as being an important aspect of national security, or the geography of our huge country. So when you think about foreign policy, there's all these different aspects of this that you need to really process and understand. But there's an addendum in this section, and President Trump specifically outlines a few more objectives. One of them is instilling a culture of meritocracy over a culture of DE&I. And it talks about reinstilling a culture of competence, rooting out so-called DE&I and other discriminatory and anti-competitive practices that degrade our institutions and hold us back. Now, if you don't like President Trump, or maybe you lean left and you read this and you say, this is racist, this is horrible, that's not what the statement is saying. The essence of the statement is saying that we're not going to allow critical race theory, which essentially puts white people, Jews, and Asians as this oppressing class, be taught or used as a system to hire people. It's not, this isn't talking about multiculturalism. This isn't talking about diversity. The whole essence of this is rooting out the specific practice of hiring simply based on a person's color. And frankly, that's demeaning, right? If you're a person of color and you're hired because of your skin color, and you're not hired because of your competence or your merit or your ability to do a job, it's demeaning. And so the document specifically highlights this and talks about this in very poignant terms here. Secondly, he also talks about unleashing our enormous energy production capacity as a strategic priority. And this is a vast difference from the Biden administration, where there was a prioritization of climate objectives as a core policy focus. In fact, the Biden administration really framed climate issues as an existential threat and integrated this into domestic and their international agenda. There was participation in the Paris Agreement with the agreement to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Irony of this, if you look at China's carbon emissions, it skyrockets to the roof. And for every other country, it's flatlines, right? So sadly, all the emissions that we reduce in our country or in Western Europe have been offset by whatever China is doing over there to produce so much and so many emissions. And so the policy change here is a vast difference from the previous administration when it comes to climate change. The document thirdly also talks about reindustrializing our economy to support the middle class and control our own supply chains and production capacities. If you lived through COVID, you know what that was like. Our supply chain was interrupted. You didn't know when shipments would arrive from China, and when it did, you weren't sure how much it would cost or if this would continue. And I think it opened up people's eyes. We need to have supply chains in the Western Hemisphere, ideally in America, in logistics that we can trust and count on that are reliable. You drive through the city or any inner city and you realize these were once factories. There were people that worked here. They were able to make a good income. And this was American manufacturing in the heart of many cities. Sadly, that's been lost. And there's a push by this administration to reintegrate that into our country again. The document fourthly talks about returning economic freedom to citizens via historic tax cuts and deregulatory efforts, making the United States the premier place to do business and invest capital. So this involves removing a lot of red tape. If you come from other countries, specifically, if you try to do business, and I can say this as someone who's Indian American, but doing business in South India is very hard. Doing business in many parts of the world involves bribery, red tape, corruption, jumping through a lot of hoops and hurdles. The goal of the Trump administration here is to cut the red tape, let people use their innovation, their entrepreneurship, their creative capacity to build and manufacture and sell freely in America. That's part of national security, right? It's important for people to have economic freedom, and that is important to how we govern our country and protect our country. Finally, the document talks about investing in emerging technologies and basic science to ensure continued prosperity, head advantage, and military dominance for future generations. Pretty obvious there, right? You want to have a competitive military, you need to be at the forefront of science. And so important that we stress that as a part of our national security. And that's fascinating, right? When you think of national security, you just think about maybe planes and tanks and guns and the size of the army, but there's a whole framework that is built upon this. Now, the document goes on to talk about our strategic principles, and these principles are interesting. And so, do you want to dive into this?
Yes. So the introduction of this, the principles section, it talks about how the foreign policy that this administration is taking is pragmatic without being pragmatist, realistic without being realist, and principled without being idealistic, and muscular without being hawkish, restrained without being dovish. So essentially, it's saying that it's not grounded in traditional political ideology, but motivated by what works for the US first, America first, right? Then it has some decorative language of how President Trump has stopped about 8 wars in the world, right? And then it gives the reasoning behind that, right? So yeah, this is not always necessarily central to our security strategy, but having peace wherever we can do it in a much more simplistic way, where it's like direct leader to leader negotiation and calming it down. It doesn't take much effort, but you reap the benefits of a friendly country. You've got soft influence, etc., for not much work. So that's the reasoning the document gives for having these quick negotiated peace deals across the world that President Trump has done. In terms of the actual principles, I'll go through the first 4 and then turn it over to you, Dennis. So the first one is, it talks about having a focused definition of national interest. So it talks about how previously the definition kept expanding to a point where anything and everything is considered to be in scope. And then, so it talks about this, makes a statement. To focus on everything is to focus on nothing. So basically what it's saying is like our core national security interests will be our focus. That's number one. Number two is the principle of peace through strength. That the principle is that strength is the best deterrent. If people know that you cannot mess around with American interests, they will not do it. And so this type of strength enables peace because of the respect that it brings. It talks about, therefore, we want to maintain the strongest economy, the best technologies, really good cultural health, and the best military in the world. And then the next one, the third one, it talks about one of the principles of being predispositioned to being non-interventional. So it talks about how this document goes back to the founding and talks about how the founding fathers laid that principle, right? That every human being possesses God-given equal natural rights. And so the phrasing is that the laws of, like, all nations are entitled by the laws of nature and nature's God to a separate and equal station with respect to one another. So this is what we said in our Declaration of Independence, referring to Great Britain, right, who the US was under. So therefore, what it says is like we have to respect other countries and their sovereignty as well. However, it also says that because we are a very diverse country and it's pretty big, you can't be very rigid in that statement and be like, I will be isolated from the world. That's not possible. But what it's saying is like, this should be our predisposition, which then therefore then sets up a very high bar of when we choose to intervene. An example, which is going on right now in the world, would be what should we do in Iran? It's a big question, and if you look through the lens of this principle, you will be able to say, okay, why has President Trump and this administration behaved the way they did with Maduro in Venezuela, or last year when they intervened in Iran and they just dropped the bunker busters and left. So you'll see the predisposition coming into play. The fourth one, the principle it talks about is having flexible realism. So what it's talking about is like when we deal with other nations, instead of having an ideological stance and it's all based on like philosophies, which doesn't work or hasn't worked over the last few decades. So what it talks about is, let's be realistic. We want to have good relationship, peaceful commercial relationship with everyone, no matter who they are, and not impose democracy on people around the world. So it ties in very well with the previous principle that says, let's respect other countries to have governed the way they want. They basically also say like having this type of realistic assessment is really a good way to think and work through countries and who have different governing system and societies than we do. And then in the meantime, there are countries that have like-minded and that they kind of share our culture, our values, and our norms. There we start partnering more and more. So it's about being as pragmatic and realistic as possible when dealing with the challenges, situations, and countries in the world.
Yeah, that's great points because sometimes you think about national security and you think, I'm just going to build like a 10,000-foot fence and I'm going to just live inside my 50 states and I'll be okay. But national security goes far beyond that, right? It involves interacting with other countries and states and ensuring their stability. Fifthly, in this document, it talks about the primacy of nations. The world's fundamental political unit is and will remain the nation state. It is natural and just that all nations put their interests first and guard their sovereignty. Here's the interesting part. The world works best when nations prioritize their interests. The United States will put our own interests first, and in our relations with other nations, encourage them to prioritize their own interests as well. We stand for the sovereign rights of nations against the sovereignty sapping incursions of the most intrusive transnational organizations, and for reforming those institutions so that they assist rather than hinder individual sovereignty and further American interests. So, in a blurb, right, how does this apply? Well, think about the CIA, right? The CIA offers intelligence to other countries to assist with internal matters. Last weekend, there was huge eruptions of explosions all over Mexico. The cartels on the west coast of Mexico lost their leader. I forgot his name, but essentially every cartel, in the nation of Mexico suddenly was blocking roads. They were blowing up things. You saw this on the news where tourists were trapped. The reason why the US wants a strong Mexico is because we want a strong America. We want a strong Mexico to fight cartels inside Mexico so that our border is safe, American tourists are safe, our own citizens are safe. And so it's not just about putting up a big fence around our country, right? Believe in the primacy of nations. We want other nations to have sovereignty over their own countries from these organizations. So that section, the primacy of nations, is fascinating. The next section talks about sovereignty and respect. The United States will unapologetically protect our own sovereignty. This includes preventing its erosion by transnational and international organizations, attempts by foreign powers or entities to censure our discourse or curtail our citizens' free speech rights, lobbying, and influence operations, etc. And it keeps going. There are transnational organizations operating in the United States. You may not know this, but the cartel operates in the United States. Now, how do I know this? I had a good friend who was a bail bondsman who had to go apprehend criminals, literally get in a car, would drive all over the country, and he would tell me stories of the cartels and how they have spotters and they know who's coming down your street. And they would actively watch law enforcement, anyone who seemed suspicious, and they would track you down. You talk to anyone in law enforcement, they'll tell you cartels operate in the United States. And our goal, right, is to really limit their influence and power of not just cartels, but any organization that is antithetical to American values that's operating within the United States. And so sovereignty and respect of our borders is important. In the Biden administration, we had an open border. No one really knows who came through that border. We still don't know. Just because they don't have a criminal background in America doesn't mean they weren't criminals in another country. And so the idea of a safe border and ensuring that we respect our sovereignty is important. Next, the document talks about a balance of power. The United States cannot allow any nation to become so dominant that it could threaten our interests. We will work with allies and partners to maintain global and regional balances of power to prevent the emergence of dominant adversaries. Now, many people take this view that American foreign policy should be isolationist. Let's take all of our military spending, which is trillions, and let's build better hospitals and roads and parks and whatever things that you can imagine that delight your heart. The problem, there are dominant adversarial powers that would take any chance to destroy America. And so this statement is important. The United States cannot allow any nation to become so dominant that it could threaten our interests. Go home, read that, think about that, right? We need to protect our borders, but we need to make sure that our enemies don't become so powerful that now we are in a weak position. The document talks about the pro American worker. American policy will be pro worker and not merely pro growth, and it will prioritize our own workers. We must rebuild an economy in which prosperity is broadly based and widely shared, not concentrated at the top or localized in certain industries or a few parts of our country. Now, if you're leaning left or you're Democratic, that sounds great, right? We want wealth to be not just at the top 1% or 5% of the echelon in our country, right? We want workers to be strong. We want working class neighborhoods to be strong. And so important for national security. The next section of the document highlights this one word, fairness, and I'll read it to you. From military alliances to trade relations and beyond, the United States will insist on being treated fairly by other nations. We will no longer tolerate and can no longer afford free-riding trade imbalances, predatory economic practices, and other impositions on our nation's historic goodwill that disadvantage our interests. As we want our allies to be rich and capable, so must our allies see that it is in their interests that the United States also remain rich and capable. In particular, we expect our allies to spend far more of their national GDP on their own defense to start to make up for the enormous imbalances accrued over decades of much greater spending by the United States. A couple points that touch on here. One, if you look at how American goods are taxed by other countries through tariffs, there's a huge trade imbalance. Right? There are some significant problems. And we've seen in the Trump administration in 2025 and 2026, a whole barrage of tariffs throughout the world on American products, on products coming into our country. But secondly, you see, I think, a hint at defense spending, especially in Europe. What we saw in Russia and Ukraine back in 2022 and continuing today, the United States had to come in and essentially defend Ukraine through a proxy, through our own weapons, and them off to Ukraine. We spent billions upon billions of dollars. The countries closest to Ukraine have spent 1 to 2% of their GDP. Countries farther away have spent just a fractional part of that. There's been a commitment now from the EU to increase that GDP spending to 5%, which is great. We want a strong EU to protect against an adversarial Russia. And so this has been highlighted in this document. Great framework that they laid out here. Finally, the last paragraph of the principles talks about competence and merit. American prosperity and security depend on the development and promotion of competence. Competence and merit are among our greatest civilizational advantages, where the best Americans are hired, promoted, and honored. Innovation and prosperity follow. Great statement. This is, again, not racist. This just states the obvious. If you're good at something, you should be hired. It says that those who are hired should be promoted and honored, and prosperity will follow. And so, competence and merit here are the standards being set when it comes to national defense. Now, this document also talks about our priorities, right? This is a shift from guiding principles to what are the priorities of national defense. And it outlines a few bullet points here.
Yeah, so based on the principles that we talked about, now we shift to the priorities. I'm going to cover the first 4 priorities and then I'll hand over the 5th one, which is actually a big one and has more subsections under there. So the number 1 priority it talks about is, it basically just says the era of mass migration is over. So here's what the document says. Who a country admits into its borders, in what numbers and from where, will inevitably define the future of their nation. Any country that considers itself sovereign has the right and duty to define its future. Throughout history, sovereign nations prohibited uncontrolled migration and granted citizenship only rarely to foreigners who also had to meet demanding criteria. The West's experience over the past decades vindicates this enduring wisdom. In countries throughout the world, mass migration has strained domestic resources, increased violence and other crimes, weakened social cohesion, distorted labor markets, and undermined national security. The era of mass migration must end. Border security is a primary element of national security. We must protect our country from invasion not just from unchecked migration, but from cross-border threats such as terrorism, drugs, espionage, and human trafficking. A border controlled by the will of the American people as implemented by their government is fundamental to the survival of the United States as a sovereign republic. So that is priority number 1 it talks about. And this, remember, is in the aftermath of the open borders policy that you mentioned. There are varying numbers, but I think almost everybody agrees that it's somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 20 million people that is admitted. I think the most common number is about 12 million people. That's a lot in just 4 years. That's just amazing. And I think among that, a good chunk, I think 1% or so, is considered to be criminals. So one of the things I want our audience to think about is, like, as you think through each strategy document, it's within the context of what has happened, where we are right now, and what we want to resolve. So this is a priority of this administration. So this is number 1. Number 2, it talks about the protection of core rights and liberties. This is an important one too. Especially take the context here and compare it to what's going on in Western Europe and other civilized societies where they supposedly have freedom and liberties. And one day in one podcast, we will cover that. But in the US, we enjoy a very unique and unconstrained level of liberty that a lot of people do not appreciate enough. So here's what the document says on that point. The purpose of the American government is to secure the God-given natural rights of American citizens. To this end, departments and agencies of the United States government have been granted fearsome powers. These powers must never be abused, whether under the guise of de-radicalization, protecting our democracy, or any other pretext. When and where those powers are abused, abusers must be held accountable. In particular, the rights of free speech, freedom of religion and of conscience, and the right to choose and steer our common government are core rights that must never be infringed. Regarding countries that share or say they share these principles, the United States will advocate strongly that they be upheld in letter and spirit. We will oppose elite-driven anti-democratic restrictions on core liberties in Europe, the Anglosphere, and the rest of the democratic world, especially among our allies. This is very interesting to see this in writing. And this is what was fascinating about our document. So the actions that the administration is taking is very consistent with the principles that it's laid out. So this priority you could see in full effect when President Trump and Vice President Vance and the Secretary of State Rubio visited Europe and gave different speeches. It's giving a very important call to our European allies to get back to the basics, protect their borders. And a lot of this is in reaction to the observations that our administration has taken from Western Europe and some of the struggles that they're having. So what they're trying to do is avoid those issues from entering the US, right? So that's number 2. Number 3 talks about burden sharing and burden shifting as a priority. And this again was fully in action that we have seen. So here's what the document says. The days of the US propping up the entire world order are over. We count among our many allies and partners dozens of wealthy, sophisticated nations that must assume primary responsibility for their regions and contribute far more to our collective defense. President Trump has set a new global standard with the Hague Commitment, which pledges NATO countries to spend 5% of GDP on defense, and which our NATO allies have endorsed and must now meet. Continuing President Trump's approach of asking allies to assume primary responsibility for their regions, the United States will organize a burden sharing network with our government as convener and supporter. This approach ensures that the burdens are shared and that all such efforts benefit from broader legitimacy. The model will be targeted partnerships that use economic tools to align incentives, share burdens with like-minded allies, and insist on reforms that anchor long-term stability. This strategic clarity will allow the US to counter hostile and subversive influences efficiently while avoiding the overextension and diffuse focus that undermine past efforts. The US will stand ready to help, potentially through more favorable treatment on commercial matters, technology sharing, defense procurement, those countries that willingly take more responsibility for security in their neighborhoods and align their export controls with ours. So it's talking about how it's very important for our allies to step up and contribute to the collective security. Case in point, had Europe been at 5% of their GDP in military spending, they would have been so robust and strong that a lot of people do not believe Russia would have invaded Ukraine. And so this is something that people need to keep in mind. Is like, you have to be pragmatic, not live in a euphoria where we just think that everybody is out to benefit everybody else in the world. That's not true. And that was a case in point was when Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked for no reason at all. Well, it's not for no reason. They have their reasons, right? We talked about their reasoning. But for the most part, that was not a true threat that was the excuse that Russia gave. The fourth one, in terms of priorities, it talks about realignment through peace. So it talks about seeking peace even in regions and countries that are peripheral to our immediate core interests in an effective way to increase stability, strengthen America's global influence, realign countries and regions towards our interests, and open new market. The resources required boil down to presidential diplomacy, which our great nation can embrace with competent leadership, and the dividends, an end to long-standing conflicts, lives saved, new friends made, can vastly outweigh the relatively minor costs of time and attention. So this is the interesting part, right? While we say that we are not going to unnecessarily intervene in the world and try to dictate terms, we are saying that there are opportunities where it doesn't take much effort from our end to secure the 8 peace deals that President Trump has done. And the benefit you get is far outweighs the minimal cost of time and attention that they spent on those conflicts. So that's the fourth one. Over to you.
Yeah, well stated. And the last section is interesting. It's on economic security. And you would ask yourself, why does this belong in a document? It belongs here because the economic health of a country is essentially to so many aspects of our national defense. And this is going to highlight some of these. First, the section talks about balanced trade. The United States will prioritize rebalancing our trade relations, trade deficits, opposing barriers to our exports, and so on. Secondly, securing access to critical supply chains and materials. The section also talks about raw materials. Interestingly enough, it says the intelligence community will monitor key supply chains and technological advances around the world to ensure and understand and mitigate vulnerabilities and threats to American security and prosperity. You never think about the CIA like monitoring your supply chain, right? But there are people watching to see where these raw materials and these critical rare earth minerals are being supplied and processed and refined. The document in this section under the economy talks about reindustrialization. It starts off with this cool phrase: the future belongs to makers. The United States will reindustrialize its economy, reshore industrial production, and encourage and attract investment in our economy and our workforce. I grew up with NAFTA, and NAFTA was the big thing during the Clinton administration, North American Free Trade Agreement, where so many American jobs, industrial jobs went to Mexico, or globalism, where after that, so many of our jobs went overseas to China. Fascinating and very stark difference here that we're going to now attempt to reindustrialize our country. The next bullet point under the economy talks about reviving our defense industrial base. A strong, capable military cannot exist without a strong, capable defense industrial base. The huge gap demonstrated in recent conflicts between low-cost drones and missiles versus the expensive systems required to defend against them has laid bare our need to change and adapt. The document in this section also talks about energy dominance, restoring American energy dominance in oil, gas, coal, and nuclear. Interestingly enough, it doesn't talk about solar or wind directly in this document. In fact, the end of this paragraph says that we reject the disastrous climate change and net zero ideologies that have so greatly harmed Europe, threatened the United States, and subsidized our adversaries. And one day we will talk about the climate and green energy and its effect on American policy. Again, we're balanced. We're not taking a strong position on that right now. I drive an EV right now, so going to be balanced about this. But the last bullet point under the economy talks about preserving and growing America's financial sector dominance. The United States boasts the world's leading financial and capital markets, which are pillars of American influence that afford policymakers significant leverage and tools to advance America's national security priorities. But our leadership cannot be taken for granted. Preserving and growing our dominance entails leveraging our dynamic free market system and our leadership in digital finance and innovation to ensure that our markets continue to be the most dynamic, liquid, and secure, and remain the envy of the world. Crypto, right, has been a focus in the Trump administration. There's so many other digital assets and unique types of investment growing in the DeFi world, if you understand what's happening in that industry. And so fascinating that in order to have a robust and strong national defense policy, that there's going to be a focus on our financial markets and our dominance in this throughout the entire world. Any final thoughts?
It is, I have admittedly never looked at the national security strategy document.
I don't think most
And
people have.
I think it's amazing. I'm never going to miss out another version of it. Like, it spells out for you the exact thinking process. As a matter of fact, I was looking back at President Biden's one, and it was released in October 2022. And I have to go back and check all the others. But I feel like I would love to see this document released in the first 6 months of an administration. I think that would be really beneficial for the American public to see in black and white. This is how we are thinking. Here's how we see the world, and here's our plan to approach it in the next 4 years. It's very informative, and I love how simple and plainly it uses how simple and plain spoken language to communicate, and everything that this administration has done, I can see how it ties back to this document. So I've been very excited reading through the document. I'm not saying that I agree with every single thing it's saying. What I'm saying is, like, I at least understand the thinking process behind it, whether it's right or wrong.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is this document was released in November 2025. It is 2026 now, and so many of these things have been materializing in the news, whether it's Venezuela, what we see in Iran, and how we've been dealing with Russia and that conflict, and Israel and Gaza. But the next section, which we'll talk about next week, is going to be interesting. The document highlights specific policy recommendations for different parts of the world, the Western Hemisphere, Asia, the Middle East, and so on. So I encourage you guys to join us, like and subscribe, so you can follow us and see more about American foreign policy. Thanks again, and hope to see you guys soon.